David stepped off the ramp of his ship, his boots making contact with the surface of Xenoria. The first sensation that hit him was the hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, resonating through his entire body. He paused, momentarily disoriented as he took in the scene before him. The docking bay was unlike anything he had seen before. Towering spires of alien architecture loomed above him, their surfaces pulsating gently with a soft, bioluminescent glow that shifted in color as they responded to the slightest movement and sound. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet yet metallic, a blend of floral and mineral notes that was both intoxicating and strange. The atmosphere itself seemed alive, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. David felt a subtle pressure, as if the planet was aware of his presence, watching him, assessing him. "Welcome to Xenoria," David. The voice was soft, melodic, and slightly accented, pulling him from his reverie. He turned to see Elara approaching him. She was taller than he expected, her slender form draped in flowing garments that seemed to shimmer and shift like liquid light. Her skin had a faint luminescence, matching the surroundings, and her expressive eyes studied him with a mixture of curiosity and warmth. "Elara," David replied, offering a hand out of habit. She glanced at his outstretched hand, hesitating for a moment before mimicking the gesture, her touch light and cool. Her confusion was palpable, but she smiled, a gesture that seemed universal. "I will be your guide during your time here," she said, withdrawing her hand gracefully. "There is much for you to see and learn, and I hope we can both benefit from this exchange." David nodded, still adjusting to the sensory overload. "Thank you, Elara. I'm looking forward to understanding your world," he meant it, though the prospect now seemed daunting. The air was thick with unfamiliarity, and every subtle movement of light and sound felt like a new challenge to navigate. Elara gestured for him to follow, leading him through the vast expanse of the docking bay toward the council hall. As they walked, David noticed the subtle exchanges between the Xenorians. They passed gestures, glances, a shift in the glow of their skin. There was communication happening here, but not in a form he understood. He felt a growing unease, a sense of being an outsider in a place where connection was everything. The council hall was an ethereal structure, suspended within a massive tree-like organism. Its walls were semi-transparent, allowing the ambient light of the planet to filter in, creating an ever-shifting pattern of shadows. The interior was calm and serene, yet there was an undercurrent of authority that made David straighten his posture as they entered. Inside, a group of Xenorians stood in a loose semicircle, their presence immediately commanding attention. These were the elders, their age marked not by wrinkles but by the depth of their luminescence and the gravity of their expressions. Elara led David to the center of the room, where he felt the weight of their gaze upon him. "Welcome, David of Earth," one of the elders intoned, his voice resonating with a deep, almost musical cadence. "You are here to learn of our ways, to understand the unity that defines our existence." David nodded, feeling the pressure of their expectations. "I am honored to be here and eager to learn." The elder's eyes seemed to bore into him, as if searching for something beneath the surface. "Unity is the core of our being. We are one with Xenoria and with each other. To live here is to connect, to share in the consciousness that binds us all." David felt a slight tightening in his chest as the elder spoke. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that he couldn't quite grasp. There was something deeper here, something he didn't fully understand. The idea of unity, of shared consciousness, was alien to him in every sense of the word. As the elders continued to speak, David's discomfort grew. He found himself struggling to keep up, to interpret the layered meanings behind their words. Every phrase seemed to hint at something more, something that eluded his understanding. He glanced at Elara, who stood beside him, her expression calm but watchful. She seemed to sense his unease, her own curiosity tempered by an understanding that he was just beginning to comprehend. The meeting ended with a final, resonant note from the elders, a sound that echoed through the hall and lingered in the air long after the words had faded. David followed Elara out, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just heard. The world outside seemed even more vibrant and overwhelming after the stillness of the council hall, the light and sound assaulting his senses once more. As they walked, David felt a growing sense of isolation. The gap between his world and theirs seemed vast, a chasm that he wasn't sure he could cross. But he was here, and he had a mission. He resolved to keep an open mind, to learn as much as he could, despite the discomfort gnawing at him. Elara broke the silence as they approached his quarters. "Our ways may seem strange, but there is much we can learn from each other," she said, her tone gentle, almost reassuring. David managed a small smile. "I didn't come all this way to fail. I just need to understand." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Understanding comes with time. You have only just begun." As he settled into the quarters that had been prepared for him, David couldn't shake the feeling of being watched not by Elara or the elders, but by the planet itself. The subtle hum, the shifting light, the ever-present scent, they all conspired to keep him on edge, a constant reminder that he was very far from home. He lay down, staring at the ceiling that pulsed gently with light, trying to still his racing thoughts. The day's events replayed in his mind, the elders' words echoing in the silence. He felt alone, more isolated than he had ever felt before. This was not just another mission, this was something else entirely, something that would demand more of him than he had ever given. As sleep finally claimed him, David couldn't help but wonder if he was truly prepared for what lay ahead. The following morning, David awoke to the soft rustling of leaves and the faint glow of morning light filtering through the translucent walls of his quarters. The hum of Xenoria's energy was a constant presence, a low, soothing vibration that seemed to resonate with the rhythm of life on the planet. It was both calming and unsettling, a reminder of the world's interconnectedness that he was only beginning to understand. Elara greeted him outside, her expression warm and composed. "I thought we might begin today with a visit to one of our villages," she suggested. "It will give you a better sense of how we live and how we connect with our environment." David agreed, eager to see more of Xenoria, though he still felt the lingering unease from the previous day. As they walked, Elara explained the significance of the village they were about to visit. It was a place where the Xenorians' connection to their environment was most apparent, where every aspect of life was intertwined with the natural world. The village was nestled deep within a bioluminescent forest, the trees and plants integrated into the architecture in ways that made it difficult to tell where nature ended and civilization began. The homes were living structures, their walls formed from the trunks of massive trees that pulsed gently with light, reacting to the presence of the villagers. The air was filled with the earthy scent of rich soil, mingled with the fragrance of flowers that bloomed as they passed. David marveled at the seamless integration of life and architecture, but he also felt overwhelmed. The vibrancy of the village, the way everything seemed to be in constant communication, was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He struggled to find his place in this web of connections, feeling like an intruder in a world that wasn't his own. As they walked through the village, Elara introduced him to some of the villagers. They greeted him with polite smiles and nods, their gestures fluid and graceful, but there was a subtle hesitation in their interactions. David noticed the way they communicated with each other, glances, slight shifts in posture, a faint change in the glow of their skin. It was all so foreign, and despite his best efforts, he found himself misinterpreting their gestures more than once. One moment, in particular, stood out. He attempted to engage with a group of villagers who were gathered around a central tree, their hands resting on its trunk as if communing with it. When David approached and tried to mimic their actions, he was met with puzzled looks and a gentle but firm correction from Elara. "They are sharing their thoughts with the tree," she explained, her tone patient. "It is a form of connection, a way to contribute to the collective consciousness of the village. But it is not something that can be mimicked without understanding." David felt a flush of embarrassment, realizing just how out of place he was. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back. "I didn't mean to intrude." Elara smiled, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "No harm done, David. You are here to learn, and learning comes with mistakes. It is through these moments that understanding grows." They continued their tour, and David listened as Elara explained the Xenorians' belief in collective consciousness, the idea that all living beings were connected through a shared network of thoughts and emotions. It was a concept that David found difficult to grasp, rooted as he was in a culture that valued individuality and personal boundaries. Their conversation deepened as they watched a village ceremony unfold. The villagers gathered in a circle, their hands linked, their bodies swaying gently in time with a chant that resonated through the forest. The energy in the air grew more intense, the light from the trees brightening and dimming in response to the ceremony. David could feel the connection between them, a palpable sense of unity that was both beautiful and intimidating. After the ceremony, David and Elara sat together on the edge of the village, overlooking the forest as the light began to fade. "Your way of life is so different," David said, struggling to find the right words. "It's like nothing I've ever seen." Elara nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Perhaps different is what we both need to understand each other." David hesitated, then decided to speak his mind. "I have to admit, this collective consciousness, it makes me uneasy. I'm used to keeping my thoughts, my feelings, to myself. The idea of sharing them, of merging them with others, it's unsettling." Elara turned to him, her expression gentle but probing. "It is a different way of being, yes, but perhaps it is not as invasive as you fear. It is about connection, about understanding each other in ways that go beyond words. It is not about losing oneself, but about finding something greater through unity." David frowned, trying to process her words. "I guess I've always valued my individuality. The idea of merging that with others, even in a positive way, feels like a loss of control." "Control can be an illusion," Elara replied softly. "We are all connected, whether we acknowledge it or not. Here, we choose to embrace that connection, to see it as a strength rather than a weakness." David was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. "Maybe I'm just not ready to let go of my way of thinking." Elara reached out and placed a hand on his, her touch light but reassuring. "There is no need to let go completely. Understanding does not require abandonment. It is possible to learn from each other, to find a balance that honors both our ways of being." David looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps there was a way to bridge the gap between their cultures, to find common ground without losing himself in the process. The day ended with Elara inviting David to spend more time in the village, to observe and participate in their daily activities. He agreed, feeling a growing sense of connection not just to Elara, but to the world around him. The unease was still there, but it was tempered by curiosity and the beginnings of understanding. As he settled into his quarters that night, David reflected on the day's events. The village, the ceremony, the conversation with Elara, it all swirled in his mind, challenging his preconceptions and pushing him to see the world through new eyes. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but for the first time since his arrival, he felt a sense of possibility. He drifted off to sleep, the hum of Xenoria's energy lulling him into a deeper rest, as the glow of the bioluminescent trees outside cast gentle, shifting patterns across his room. The path ahead was uncertain, but David was beginning to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he could find his way. David stood at the entrance to the Xenorian Elder's chamber, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. The chamber, deep within one of the oldest trees on the planet, was dimly lit by bioluminescent symbols that lined the walls, casting a soft glow over ancient artifacts and symbols of unity. The air was thick with the scent of incense, sharp and earthy, filling his lungs as he stepped inside. The elders were already gathered, their expressions solemn as they watched him approach. Elara had mentioned that the elders wanted to speak with him, but she hadn't specified why. Now, standing before them, David felt the full force of their scrutiny. He had come to Xenoria to learn and to build bridges, but the intensity of their gaze made him feel like an intruder in a place where he was not entirely welcome. One of the elders, a tall figure with a deep and steady luminescence, stepped forward. "David of Earth," he began, his voice resonating with a musical quality that was both soothing and authoritative. "We have observed your time with Elara. You have been a guest in our world, and we appreciate your efforts to understand our ways." David inclined his head respectfully. "I'm honored to be here and to learn from you." The elder's gaze sharpened. "And yet, there are concerns. Your influence on Elara is growing, and with it, a potential threat to the balance we have maintained for centuries." David blinked, caught off guard. "A threat? I don't understand. Another elder, her voice softer but no less commanding, spoke next. Our unity, our connection, is the foundation of our society. Individual emotional bonds, particularly those with outsiders, can disrupt this harmony. They can lead to division, to conflict. David felt a chill run down his spine. I have no intention of disrupting anything. Elara and I are simply trying to understand each other's cultures. The first elder nodded, though his expression remained serious. Understanding is important, yes, but we must caution you, David. Elara's bond with you is growing stronger, and with it, the risk of her becoming too attached to individuality, to emotions that are not shared by the collective. This could lead to dangerous outcomes, not just for her, but for our society as a whole. David's chest tightened. He had come here to foster understanding, not to cause harm, but now it seemed his very presence was seen as a threat. I hear your concerns, he said carefully. I'll be mindful of my interactions with Elara, and I'll do my best to respect your ways. The elders exchanged glances, a silent communication that David could not decipher. Finally, the elder who had spoken first inclined his head slightly. We appreciate your understanding. We do not wish to impede your mission, but we must protect the integrity of our culture. David nodded, though the weight on his shoulders only grew heavier. I understand. The meeting ended, and as David walked out of the chamber, the fresh air outside felt like a relief after the oppressive atmosphere within. But the vibrant energy of Xenoria that had once filled him with awe now felt almost suffocating. He needed space to think, to process what had just happened. As he wandered deeper into the forest, far from the village, he tried to make sense of the elders' warnings. He had known from the beginning that this mission would be challenging, but he hadn't anticipated feeling so alienated, so out of place. The gap between his world and theirs seemed wider than ever, and he wasn't sure how to bridge it. Elara found him sitting on a fallen log, his head in his hands. She approached quietly, her steps barely making a sound on the forest floor. David, she said softly, are you all right? He looked up at her, his expression strained. The elders, they think I'm a threat. They think my influence on you is dangerous. Elara frowned, sitting down beside him. They worry about many things. It is their role to protect our ways, to ensure that our society remains whole. But I don't want to disrupt anything, David said, his voice laced with frustration. I'm just trying to understand, to build a connection. But now it feels like everything I do is wrong, like I'm just making things worse. Elara placed a hand on his arm, her touch calming. You are not making things worse. You are learning, as am I. This is part of the process, David. It is not easy to bridge such different worlds. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm so confused. Everything here is so different. The way you communicate, the way you connect. It's so alien to me, and now I'm being told that even trying to understand it could be harmful. Elara's expression softened. David, you are not alone in your confusion. I, too, have been learning, questioning. There are things about your world that I do not understand, but I want to. This is not just your journey, it is ours. Her words were comforting, but they didn't completely dispel the doubt gnawing at him. He looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, but also the uncertainty. Elara, do you ever wonder if maybe we're pushing too far? If maybe the differences between us are too great? Elara was silent for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. I have wondered, yes, but I also believe that we can find a way to understand each other, to bridge the gap between our worlds. It will not be easy, but if we do not try, we will never know what is possible. David felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on his own struggles that he hadn't fully considered what this was like for Elara. She was navigating just as much unfamiliar territory as he was, but with the added pressure of her culture's expectations. I'm sorry, Elara. I didn't mean to put you in a difficult position. She shook her head. You have not. This is my choice just as it is yours. And I choose to continue, to learn and to grow, even if it means facing challenges. David managed a small smile. You're stronger than I am. Elara returned the smile, though it was tinged with sadness. Perhaps, but strength is not always enough. We must also be wise and patient. The elders' concerns are not without merit. We must be careful, but that does not mean we must stop." David nodded, though he still felt uneasy. The elders' warnings weighed heavily on him, but so did the growing bond he felt with Elara. He knew he couldn't abandon his mission, but he also couldn't ignore the connection that was developing between them. It was a delicate balance, one that he wasn't sure he could maintain. As they sat in the quiet of the forest, David felt a sense of calm slowly settle over him. The uncertainty was still there, but it was tempered by the understanding that this journey was shared, that he and Elara were navigating it together, each learning and adapting as they went. When they returned to the village, the air between them was lighter, though the weight of their decisions still loomed in the background. David knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he wasn't facing it alone. David's footsteps echoed in the silence as he made his way deeper into the forest, his thoughts a tumultuous mix of doubt, fear, and frustration. The conversation with Elara had left him feeling more conflicted than ever, and the weight of the elders' warnings only added to his growing sense of isolation. He needed space, time to think, to sort through the conflicting emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He had heard of a secluded cave not far from the village, a place where the Xenorians went to meditate and reflect. It seemed like the perfect place to clear his mind, to find some semblance of clarity in the midst of the chaos that had taken hold of his life. The forest around him was dense, the trees towering high above, their leaves creating a canopy that blocked out much of the light. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the vibrant energy of the village. When he finally reached the cave, he paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The interior was dimly lit by the soft glow of bioluminescent fungi that clung to the walls, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the rough stone floor. The air was thick with moisture, the sound of dripping water echoing through the space, creating a rhythmic backdrop that mirrored the turmoil in David's mind. He found a flat rock near the back of the cave and sat down, leaning against the cool stone wall. For a long moment he simply sat there, staring at the ground, trying to quiet the storm of thoughts that raged within him. But the more he tried to find peace, the more his mind rebelled, replaying the events of the past few days over and over again. He thought of the elders, their grave warnings, and the look of concern in Elara's eyes. He thought of the bond that had been growing between them, a bond that was both exhilarating and terrifying. And he thought of the ritual, the merging of consciousness that had become a symbol of everything he feared about this strange, alien world. It wasn't just the ritual that frightened him, it was what it represented. The loss of control, the surrendering of his individuality to something greater. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to think and act for himself. The idea of giving that up, even for a moment, was more than he could bear. As he sat there lost in thought, memories from his past began to surface. He remembered the early days of his career, the pressure to prove himself, to show that he was capable of handling whatever challenges came his way. He remembered the sacrifices he had made, the relationships he had pushed aside in favor of his work. He had always told himself that it was worth it, that the pursuit of his goals was more important than anything else. But now, as he sat alone in the darkness, he wondered if he had been wrong. He had built walls around himself, walls that had kept him safe but also kept him isolated. And now, those walls were being threatened, not by an enemy, but by the possibility of connection, of intimacy. The sound of footsteps approaching the cave entrance pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up, his heart quickening as Elara stepped into the dim light, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "David," she said softly, her voice echoing in the small space, "I was worried about you." He looked away, guilt gnawing at him. "I needed some time to think." Elara moved closer, her footsteps quiet on the stone floor. "I understand. This is not easy for either of us." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to do, Elara. Everything here is so overwhelming. I want to connect with you, I really do, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid of losing myself, of becoming something I'm not." Elara knelt beside him, her eyes filled with empathy. "You don't have to lose yourself, David. The ritual, the connection, it's not about erasing who you are. It's about finding a way to understand each other, to share in each other's experiences. But if you're not ready, that's okay. We can find another way." David shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. But what if there isn't another way? What if this is the only way to truly connect, and I'm too afraid to do it? What does that say about me? Elara reached out, gently taking his hand in hers. "It says that you are human, and that you are facing something new and difficult. Fear is natural, David. It's how we deal with that fear that defines us." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for some kind of answer, some reassurance that everything would be all right. But all he saw was the same uncertainty that he felt, the same doubts and fears. They were both standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and neither of them knew what would happen if they took the next step. "Elara," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I'm scared. Scared of losing who I am, of becoming lost in something I don't understand." Elara squeezed his hand, her touch warm and steady. "Maybe unity isn't about losing ourselves, but finding something greater together." David stared at her, her words sinking in. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that they could find a way through this together. But the fear still lingered, a shadow that refused to be dispelled. For a long moment they sat in silence, the sound of the dripping water the only noise in the cave. Then, finally, David took a deep breath and nodded. "I don't know if I'm ready, Elara. But I don't want to lose you. I want to try, even if it scares me." Elara smiled, a soft, sad smile. "We'll take it one step at a time, David. We don't have to rush. What matters is that we're both willing to try." David nodded again, feeling a tentative sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to in the midst of the uncertainty that surrounded them. They sat together in the cave for a while longer, the silence between them no longer heavy with unspoken tension, but with the quiet understanding that they were in this together. When they finally stood to leave, David felt a little lighter, a little more sure of his place in this strange, alien world. As they walked back to the village, Elara's hand still in his, David knew that the challenges they faced were far from over. The elder's warning still hung over him, and the thought of the ritual still filled him with dread. But for the first time he felt that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to navigate the complexities of their worlds without losing themselves in the process. When they reached the village, the sky was beginning to darken, the bioluminescent plants glowing softly in the twilight. Elara paused at the entrance to her quarters, turning to face David. "Thank you for being honest with me, David. It means more than you know." David smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you for understanding, Elara. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm glad we're in this together." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We'll figure it out. Together." David watched as she entered her quarters, the door closing softly behind her. He stood there for a moment, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He still had doubts, still felt the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. But as he turned to head to his own quarters, he felt a small spark of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him moving forward, one step at a time. The sacred bonding chamber loomed before David and Elara, its ancient structure nestled deep within the forest. The air was thick with the energy of countless rituals performed here over millennia, each one leaving an indelible mark on the atmosphere. The walls, formed from the heart of an ancient tree, pulsed with a steady, rhythmic light that seemed to sync with David's own heartbeat. He could feel the weight of history in the air, pressing down on him with a significance that was almost suffocating. Elara stood beside him, her expression calm but serious. The gravity of the moment was not lost on her, and she reached out, taking David's hand in hers. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," she whispered, her voice steady, offering him a lifeline in the sea of uncertainty. David nodded, squeezing her hand for support. "I trust you, Elara. Let's find a way through this." As they entered the chamber, the light grew brighter, nearly blinding in its intensity. The air buzzed with a palpable energy, ancient and powerful, making the hair on the back of David's neck stand on end. The elders were already there, standing in a semicircle, their expressions a mixture of solemnity and expectation. The division among them was clear. Some eyes glowed with approval, others with doubt and concern. The elder who had spoken to David before stepped forward, his gaze steady and unreadable. "You have chosen a path that diverges from tradition, one that challenges the very core of our unity. But we are here to witness your commitment and the outcome of this union." David's heart pounded in his chest as the ritual began. The chamber filled with a deep, resonant chanting, the voices of the elders echoing off the walls and seeming to come from the very earth beneath their feet. The light in the chamber intensified, swirling around David and Elara as they stood at the center of the circle, their hands still clasped together. The sensation of energy flowing between them was immediate and overwhelming. It started as a warmth in David's chest, spreading outward until it enveloped his entire body. It was like nothing he had ever experienced, intimate, profound, yet terrifying in its intensity. He could feel Elara's presence merging with his, her thoughts, memories, and emotions brushing against his own. For a moment he panicked, fearing the loss of his identity, the very thing he had fought so hard to preserve. But then, Elara's presence soothed him, grounding him in the here and now. He realized that this merging was not about losing himself, but about sharing, about finding a balance between their two worlds. Slowly the fear ebbed, replaced by a deep sense of connection and understanding. He could feel Elara's love, her doubts, her hopes all laid bare before him, just as his own were to her. The ritual reached its climax, and David knew they were at a crossroads. They could fully merge, become one in a way that was permanent and irreversible, or they could choose to retain their individuality, finding a balance that respected both their cultures. He looked into Elara's eyes, searching for the answer. "We choose balance," Elara said softly, echoing his thoughts. "We honor our unity, but we also honor our individuality." The energy around them shifted, softening, as if the chamber itself approved of their choice. The chanting of the elders grew softer, more harmonious, and the blinding light began to recede. Slowly, the intense connection between David and Elara eased, leaving them both standing in the center of the chamber, still themselves, but somehow more. The ritual was complete, but the air was still thick with tension. David could feel the weight of the elders' gazes on them, some filled with relief, others with lingering doubt. They had made their choice, but the implications of that choice were just beginning to unfold. As they left the chamber, the atmosphere outside felt different. The forest was quiet, the usual hum of Xenoria's energy muted, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Word of the ritual would spread quickly, and David knew they were about to face the consequences of their decision. Elara walked beside him, her hand still in his, but the tension in her posture was evident. "This is only the beginning," she said quietly, her voice tinged with concern. David nodded, his own thoughts heavy. "I know, but we've set something in motion, something that can't be undone." They made their way back to the village, where the reactions were immediate. Some villagers looked at them with curiosity, others with trepidation. The elders who had supported the modified ritual stood by them, their expressions resolute, while those who had opposed it remained distant, their faces shadowed by uncertainty. David felt a mix of emotions: relief that the ritual was over, fear of what was to come, and a growing sense of responsibility. They had chosen a path that diverged from tradition, and now they had to navigate the consequences of that choice, not just for themselves, but for the entire planet. As night fell, the village was quiet, the usual energy subdued. David and Elara stood together at the edge of the village, looking out at the forest, their minds heavy with the weight of what they had done. "We've changed something today," David said softly, breaking the silence. Elara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yes, but change is not always easy. There will be resistance, doubt. But I believe we've taken the first step towards something greater." David turned to her, his hand brushing against hers. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Elara smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of the challenges ahead. "Yes, together." The aftermath of the ritual rippled through Xenoria like a shockwave. The news spread quickly, igniting debates and protests throughout the capital. The once harmonious society was now divided, with some Xenorians embracing the change as a necessary evolution, while others saw it as a dangerous deviation from their core values. David and Elara found themselves at the center of the storm. They had become symbols of the new era, their bond representing both the potential and the danger of the path they had chosen. The capital, usually a place of calm and order, was now filled with tension and uncertainty. Voices echoed through the streets, some calling for unity, others for a return to tradition. David felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him as he stood before the gathered crowd in the central square. Elara was by his side, her presence a steadying force in the midst of the chaos. They had come here to address the growing unrest, to advocate for the understanding that had brought them together. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began to speak. We stand at a crossroads, a moment in our history where we must choose how we move forward. Elara and I have shown that it is possible to honor both unity and individuality, to find a balance that respects our differences while embracing our commonalities. The crowd was silent, the tension palpable as they listened. David could see the doubt in some of their eyes, the fear of change that gripped them, but he also saw hope, a glimmer of possibility in those who were ready to embrace a new way of thinking. Elara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. We are not asking you to abandon your beliefs, but to expand them, to allow room for growth and change. Our bond does not diminish our connection to Xenoria, it enhances it, showing us new ways to understand each other and ourselves. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, but it was clear that not everyone was convinced. The traditionalists, those who had opposed the ritual, were vocal in their dissent, their faces marked with suspicion and fear. David knew that this was only the beginning of the struggle, that convincing everyone would take time and patience. As they finished their address, the crowd began to disperse, some lingering to speak with the elders who supported the new direction, others retreating to discuss among themselves. The atmosphere was still charged with tension, but there was also a sense of possibility, a hint of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way forward. Later that day, the human government responded to the news of the ritual. Their initial reaction was one of caution, wary of the implications of such a deep bond between a human and an alien species. But as David and Elara presented their case, emphasizing the potential for a stronger alliance and deeper understanding between their peoples, the tone began to shift. The human leaders recognized the value in what had been achieved, seeing it as an opportunity to strengthen ties and explore new possibilities for cooperation. The bond between David and Elara was no longer just a personal connection, it had become a symbol of the potential for unity between their two worlds. But the tensions within Xenorian society were far from resolved. As David and Elara worked to mediate the growing unrest, they encountered resistance from those who saw the changes as a threat to their way of life. The traditionalists were vocal in their opposition, organizing protests and calling for a return to the old ways. David and Elara knew they had to act quickly to prevent the situation from escalating into violence. They spent long hours meeting with different factions, listening to their concerns, and working to find common ground. It was exhausting work, but they were determined to show that understanding and compromise were possible. The climax of the conflict came when a faction of traditionalists attempted to disrupt the new order, staging a demonstration that threatened to turn violent. David and Elara, along with the elders who supported them, intervened, using their influence to calm the situation before it could spiral out of control. The resolution came not through force, but through dialogue. David and Elara stood before the crowd, speaking from the heart about the importance of finding a way to coexist, to honor both tradition and progress. Their words, coupled with the support of the reformist elders, helped to diffuse the tension, leading to a tentative peace. In the days that followed, the capital began to settle into a new rhythm. The protests subsided, replaced by discussions and debates that, while still heated, were more constructive. The society was still divided, but there was a growing sense that a path forward was possible. The chapter ended with a ceremony celebrating the new alliance between humans and Xenorians. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism, as both sides came together to acknowledge the progress that had been made. The ceremony was filled with symbolic acts, Xenorian and human leaders standing side by side, sharing their visions for a future where their peoples could work together in harmony. As the ceremony drew to a close, David and Elara stood together, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. They knew that the challenges were far from over, that the path ahead would be difficult and fraught with obstacles. But they also knew that they had taken the first steps toward a new era, one where unity and individuality could coexist, where understanding and empathy could bridge even the deepest divides. David turned to Elara, his expression thoughtful. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "We've proven that understanding and unity can coexist, but there's still so much work to be done." Elara nodded, her gaze steady. "Our bond shows what's possible when we embrace both our differences and our shared humanity. We've laid the groundwork, but it's up to all of us to build on it." They stood there for a moment longer, taking in the sight of Xenorians and humans mingling, exchanging ideas and forging new connections. It was a vision of what could be, a glimpse of the future they were working toward. As they walked away from the ceremony, hand in hand, they felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a determination to continue their work. The road ahead would not be easy, but they were ready to face it together, knowing that their bond had the power to change not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. The new era had begun, and with it came the promise of a future where unity and individuality could thrive side by side, where the lessons learned from their journey would shape the destiny of both their worlds.